The blood on my wedding dress had turned brown by the time I finally understood what I had married into, but I can still see it when I close my eyes. Not the bright red of a fresh wound, but the rust-colored stain of something that had died slowly, deliberately. I was Eleanor Vance then, 22 years old, and foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. Now sitting in this Chicago apartment 7 years later, I know that some stories can only end one way, with the destruction of everyone who tried to write your ending for you. The house at 412 Elm Street in Millbrook, Indiana, looked like every other dream home in 1952. America white clapboard siding, green shutters, a wraparound porch, where my husband Arthur would wave to neighbors each morning before heading to his accounting firm downtown. The American dream made manifest in wood and paint and perfectly trimmed hedges. But dreams, I learned, have a way of rotting from the inside out, and the most dangerous prisons are the ones that look like paradise from the outside. I should have known something was wrong when Arthur's eyes remained cold even as he spoke his wedding vows, or when his mother Beatrice gripped my arm so tightly during the reception that her fingers left bruises beneath my long gloves. But I was young, and I mistook his composure for strength, his mother's intensity for passionate devotion to family. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that I wasn't Arthur's first wife. I was simply the latest in a long line of young women who had disappeared into that perfect house on Elm Street, never to be seen again. My childhood in Millbrook had been unremarkable in the most beautiful way possible. Daddy worked at Morrison's grain elevator, coming home each evening with flour dust in his hair, and stories about the farmers who brought their harvest to market. Mama kept house with quiet efficiency, her days filled with the rhythms of cooking, cleaning, and tending the vegetable garden that provided most of our food. We weren't wealthy, Daddy's wages barely stretched to cover our modest needs, but our small house on Maple Street was filled with the kind of gentle affection I assumed all families shared. Mama and Daddy never raised their voices to each other, never used harsh words or cruel silences as weapons. Their love was steady and reliable, like the change of seasons. Love doesn't have to be loud to be real, sweetheart. Mama would tell me when I was small, watching Daddy slip wildflowers into her apron pocket as he passed her chair. Sometimes the quietest love is the strongest kind. I inherited Mama's gift for homemaking and her belief that a woman's greatest strength lay in creating harmony for those she loved. But I also had Daddy's curiosity about the world beyond our small town. Every afternoon after school, I would walk to the Millbrook Public Library, losing myself in novels and magazines that filled my head with dreams of romance and adventure. It was there, surrounded by dusty volumes of poetry and biography, that I first encountered the books that would later save my life. Mrs. Crawford, the elderly head librarian, had an unusual collection of true crime stories and legal texts that she shared with patrons who showed genuine interest in how justice worked or failed to work in the real world. Knowledge is power, dear," she would say, sliding another book across the circulation desk toward me. "The more you understand about how people think and behave, the better equipped you'll be to protect yourself from those who don't have your best interests at heart." I devoured those books with the same intensity I brought to romantic novels, never imagining how crucial such knowledge would become. I read about criminal psychology, about legal procedures for divorce, and property rights, about investigative techniques that police used to solve complex cases. I even checked out a manual on lockpicking that had been donated by a retired detective fascinated by the mechanical precision required to open doors that others wanted to keep closed. Arthur Hartwell began courting me during my senior year of high school, appearing at church socials and community events, with the kind of confident charm that made every unmarried woman in 3 counties take notice. He was 27 to my 18, established in his family's accounting business, and blessed with the sort of classical good looks that belonged in magazine advertisements. "Eleanor Vance," he said the first time he asked me to dance at the Harvest Festival, his hand warm and steady on my waist. "I've been watching you, and I think you're exactly the kind of girl who could make a man very happy." His attention was intoxicating. Where other boys my age stumbled through conversations and blushed when they tried to pay compliments, Arthur spoke with the polished confidence of someone who had never doubted his own worth. He brought me expensive roses instead of roadside wildflowers, took me to dinner at the hotel restaurant instead of the local soda fountain, treated me like a sophisticated woman rather than a small-town girl. Most importantly, he treated me with a respect that seemed almost reverent during our courtship. He kept his hands to himself, content with gentle kisses on my front porch and conversations about our future together. He spoke of marriage as a sacred partnership, of building something beautiful and lasting that would honor both our families. I want a wife who will be my equal in every way that matters, he told me one evening as we sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in Mama's garden. Someone intelligent enough to understand my ambitions, graceful enough to support them, and wise enough to help me become the man I'm meant to be. His mother, Beatrice Hartwell, made her approval of our courtship clear from the beginning. She was 55 years old, widowed for nearly a decade, and utterly devoted to her only son's happiness and success. The first time Arthur brought me to tea at the family home, she welcomed me with maternal warmth that seemed genuine and deeply caring. Arthur needs a wife who understands what it means to be part of the Hartwell family, she explained, her hands busy with delicate embroidery as we sat in her perfectly appointed parlor. We have a reputation in this community for integrity, for excellence, for maintaining the highest standards in all things. It's not a burden, dear, it's an honor. She began teaching me the household routines that had been passed down through 3 generations of Hartwell wives. The precise way to fold bed linens so the corners would be mathematically perfect, the proper method for polishing silver until it gleamed like mirrors, the exact temperature for Arthur's morning coffee, and the timing for presenting his meals. A well-managed household is like a beautiful piece of music, Beatrice observed one afternoon, adjusting the placement of a crystal vase by perhaps an inch. Every note must be perfect, every rhythm precisely timed. When a woman creates true harmony in her home, she gives her family something more valuable than comfort. She gives them peace. I practiced her lessons with the dedication of a devoted student, memorizing Arthur's preferences and learning to anticipate his needs before he expressed them. I shaped myself into the perfect wife in training, eager to please and grateful for their patient instruction. But there were small details that troubled me, moments that didn't quite fit with the romantic image of marriage I had carried into our relationship. Arthur was never spontaneous. Every gesture, every conversation, every moment of affection seemed carefully calculated, as if he were following a script rather than expressing genuine emotion. More disturbing were the casual cruelties that would slip out during unguarded moments. Arthur would make cutting observations about our neighbors, our friends, even members of his own extended family, speaking of them with a contempt that seemed to contradict his public persona of generous respectability. Mrs. Patterson thinks she's so refined because she went to teacher's college, he observed one afternoon, referring to our elderly neighbor who had taught school for 30 years. But look at her now, living in that tiny house, wearing dresses that went out of style a decade ago. Education means nothing if you don't have the intelligence to marry well. When I gently suggested that Mrs. Patterson seemed content with her life, Arthur's smile grew sharp around the edges. You're too trusting, Eleanor. Too willing to see good where none exists. The world is full of people who will take advantage of that kind of naivety if you let them. Our conversations had a way of ending with Arthur correcting my opinions or explaining why my instincts were misguided. It happened so gradually, so gently, that I barely recognized it was occurring. He never raised his voice or spoke harshly, but somehow I always ended up apologizing for thoughts I hadn't realized were inappropriate. The wedding in April 1952 was everything a young girl could dream of. Hundreds of guests, flowers that had been ordered from 3 different cities, a reception that lasted until midnight and left everyone declaring it the social event of the decade. My dress had been designed by a seamstress in Indianapolis, my cake created by a baker who usually worked only for the wealthiest families in the state. "You look like a princess, sweetheart," Mama whispered as she fastened my grandmother's pearl necklace around my throat. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she stepped back to admire the transformation of her quiet daughter into a radiant bride. But it was Daddy's words that stayed with me as I walked down the church aisle. "Be happy, Eleanor. You deserve all the love in the world, and don't let anyone ever tell you different." Standing at the altar beside Arthur, surrounded by the approval and celebration of our entire community, I believed I had found exactly that kind of love. The promises we spoke seemed sacred and eternal, a foundation strong enough to support whatever challenges the future might bring. I had no idea that I was actually attending my own funeral, that the girl named Eleanor Vance was being buried beneath the expectations and requirements of becoming Mrs. Arthur Hartwell. The first 6 months of marriage passed like a carefully choreographed performance each day, following routines that Beatrice had taught me with military precision. I rose at 5:30 to prepare Arthur's breakfast, spent mornings cleaning and organizing our house according to her exacting standards, devoted afternoons to shopping and meal preparation, and filled evenings with the domestic activities that proper wives were expected to pursue. Arthur was the perfect husband during those early months, attentive, without being demanding, affectionate, without being overwhelming. He complimented my cooking, praised my housekeeping, and seemed genuinely pleased with how quickly I had adapted to the requirements of married life. "You're everything I hoped for, Eleanor," he told me one evening in July, his arm around my shoulders as we sat on our front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Sometimes I can hardly believe I was lucky enough to find you." But there were details that didn't align with the romantic image of marriage I had cherished. Arthur was never spontaneous in his affections. Every kiss, every embrace, every moment of intimacy seemed as carefully planned and executed as a business transaction. Our physical relationship, while respectful, lacked the passion I had read about in novels or witnessed in the gentle touches between my parents. More troubling was the way Arthur spoke about other people when we were alone. His public persona was charming and generous, but in private, he often made observations that revealed a cold, calculating assessment of human nature that seemed fundamentally at odds with the loving husband I thought I had married. Miller came by the office today, practically begging me to take on his expanded accounts, Arthur mentioned one evening, referring to David Miller, who owned the largest grain processing operation in 3 counties. "The man has no idea how to manage his own finances. It's almost criminal how easily someone could take advantage of his trust." When I suggested that Mr. Miller had always seemed like a decent, hard-working man, Arthur's expression grew patronizing. "Eleanor, darling, you're far too innocent for your own good. Miller is decent because he can afford to be. He has more money than sense, and no real understanding of how business actually works. Men like that need guidance from people who understand the complexities of financial management." I began to notice how often our conversations ended with Arthur explaining why my perceptions were naive or misguided. He never raised his voice or spoke harshly, but somehow I always found myself apologizing for opinions I hadn't realized were wrong. The real change began in October, when Arthur started coming home from work with whiskey on his breath. He claimed it was business-related client meetings that required social drinking, professional obligations, that were part of building relationships in the business community. "A man in my position has to maintain certain appearances," he explained when I expressed mild concern about the frequency of his drinking. "These farmers and businessmen expect their accountant to understand their world, to be able to share a glass of bourbon and discuss their concerns in a relaxed atmosphere." But I could see how the alcohol affected him. His carefully controlled demeanor would slip, revealing glimpses of something colder and more calculating beneath the surface. He began making comments about my appearance, my intelligence, my worthiness as his wife, observations delivered in a tone of gentle correction that somehow hurt more than outright criticism would have. "That dress makes you look heavier than you actually are, Eleanor," he observed one evening as I served dinner. "A man's wife is a reflection of his success and good judgment. You should take more care with how you present yourself to the world. I've explained this twice now, and you still seem confused. Are you listening when I speak to you? Or are you too distracted by your own thoughts to pay attention to important matters? Sometimes I wonder if I should have chosen someone with more sophistication, more experience with the kind of life I'm trying to build. Perhaps a woman who could truly appreciate the opportunities I'm offering. Each criticism was followed immediately by reassurance that he loved me despite my failings, that he was only trying to help me become the best version of myself. The combination of cruelty and kindness was more disorienting than consistent abuse would have been. It left me constantly off balance, never sure whether I was being loved or punished. The first time Arthur struck me, the shock was so complete that I couldn't process what had happened. It was a Thursday evening in mid-October, and he had been drinking steadily since arriving home from work. I was preparing dinner when he announced that his business partner James Morrison would be joining us the following evening. I'll need you to prepare something that demonstrates your capabilities as a hostess, Arthur said, loosening his tie as he spoke. James is considering bringing me into a very profitable venture, and I want him to see that I have the kind of wife who can handle sophisticated entertaining. I had been planning to serve my grandmother's pot roast recipe, a reliable dish that had never failed to please, but I wanted to show Arthur how much his approval meant to me. What if I tried that chicken recipe with wine sauce that I saw in Ladies' Home Journal? It looked quite elegant, and I think I could manage it successfully. Arthur's response was immediate and shocking. His open hand struck my cheek with enough force to send me stumbling backward into the kitchen counter, my vision exploding with stars of pain and disbelief. For several seconds, neither of us moved or spoke. I stood with one hand pressed to my burning cheek, unable to form words or coherent thoughts, while Arthur watched me with the detached interest of someone observing the results of a scientific experiment. Did I ask for suggestions about the menu? His voice remained calm and conversational, as if he had just commented on the weather rather than committed an act of violence. I told you what I needed, Eleanor. Your job is to accomplish it efficiently, not to question my judgment with amateur alternatives. I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, to somehow make sense of what had just occurred, but Arthur continued before I could find my voice. Let me be very clear about something, since you seem to be confused about the nature of our arrangement. In this marriage, I make the decisions. You implement them. When you forget that fundamental principle, there are consequences. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the echo of his words and the throbbing pain in my cheek. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of our bedroom door closing with deliberate finality, and then a silence that felt heavier than any noise could have been. I stood in the kitchen for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to reconcile what had just happened with everything I thought I knew about my husband and our marriage. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Arthur was under stress from work. He had drunk too much. This was an isolated incident that would never happen again. But a deeper, more primitive instinct was already cataloging escape routes and calculating distances to doors and windows, already beginning the mental preparation that would eventually save my life. When Beatrice arrived the next morning for her regular Friday visit, she took one look at the makeup I had carefully applied to conceal my bruise and smiled with an expression I had never seen before, satisfaction mixed with something that resembled approval. "Good morning, Eleanor, dear," she said, settling into her usual chair at our kitchen table with the air of someone who had been expecting this moment. "I trust you slept well?" Her tone carried implications that made my skin crawl, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "Yes, thank you. Arthur mentioned that Mr. Morrison will be joining us for dinner tonight. I thought I would prepare pot roast. It's always been one of Arthur's favorites." "An excellent choice." Beatrice agreed, her eyes lingering on the foundation makeup that concealed my bruise. "Simple, traditional, perfectly executed, exactly what discerning men expect from their wives' cooking." She paused, studying my face with clinical interest. "Arthur mentioned that you seemed somewhat confused about the arrangements yesterday evening. These situations can be overwhelming for young wives who aren't accustomed to the pressures of entertaining important business associates. The casual way she referenced the previous night's confusion sent ice through my veins. Arthur had discussed our confrontation with his mother, had apparently presented it as a minor domestic disagreement rather than an act of violence. And Beatrice's response suggested that she not only knew what had really happened, but approved of Arthur's methods for maintaining household discipline. "Marriage is a learning process, dear." Beatrice continued, her tone gentle and maternal. "Sometimes the lessons are difficult, but they're necessary for establishing the kind of harmony that makes a household function properly. Arthur has very high standards for himself, for his business, and for his family. Meeting those standards requires dedication and flexibility on everyone's part." I nodded wordlessly, beginning to understand that my isolation was more complete than I had realized. Arthur hadn't just struck me in a moment of drunken anger, he had revealed the existence of a conspiracy that included his mother, and quite possibly others, to reshape me into whatever version of a wife they had decided I should become. That evening's dinner party was a masterpiece of performance art. Arthur played the role of devoted husband with flawless conviction, complimenting my cooking and praising my domestic skills to James Morrison with every appearance of genuine pride. I played my part as the grateful wife, smiling at appropriate moments and speaking only when directly addressed, while my bruised cheek throbbed beneath its careful concealment. "You're a fortunate man, Arthur," James observed over coffee and dessert, his approving gaze taking in both the perfectly prepared meal and my quiet compliance. "Eleanor seems to have mastered the art of being both beautiful and useful, a rare combination in modern wives." "I couldn't agree more," Arthur replied, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand with apparent affection. "Eleanor understands that marriage is a partnership, and she's committed to doing her part to make our household a success in every respect." After James left, Arthur helped me clear the dishes with uncharacteristic solicitude, praising my performance throughout the evening and seeming genuinely pleased with how I had handled my first formal entertaining as his wife. "You see how much smoother things go when you trust my judgment?" he asked as we finished washing the crystal glasses. "Tonight was perfect because you followed instructions instead of trying to impose your own amateur ideas on important situations." I murmured agreement, my mind already beginning to catalog the evening's lessons. Arthur's violence the night before hadn't been a loss of control. It had been a calculated method for ensuring my compliance during an important business dinner. The cruelty had served a specific purpose, and that purpose had been achieved with cold efficiency. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in our bedroom mirror and saw something in my own eyes that hadn't been there before. The trusting innocence of Eleanor Vance was fading, replaced by the watchful caution of a woman who had learned that her survival might depend on her ability to deceive those closest to her. I was beginning to understand that my fairy tale marriage was actually a carefully constructed prison, and that escape would require skills I had never imagined needing. But I was also beginning to realize that I possessed resources my captors had overlooked: intelligence, determination, and access to knowledge that could be turned into weapons if I was clever enough to use it properly. The war for my freedom had begun, and I was no longer the naive girl who had walked down the church aisle believing in happily ever after. The systematic destruction of my sense of self began in earnest after that first dinner party, as Arthur and Beatrice implemented what I now understand was a carefully planned campaign designed to break down my independence and replace it with complete dependence on their approval. Arthur's drinking became a nightly ritual, and with it came increasingly elaborate forms of psychological manipulation designed to convince me that I was fundamentally flawed as both a wife and a human being. But the physical violence was only part of their strategy. They were far more sophisticated in their cruelty than I had initially realized. "Eleanor, sweetheart, come sit with me for a moment," Arthur would say some evenings, his voice gentle and concerned, as he patted the sofa cushion beside his chair. "I've been thinking about your adjustment difficulties, and I want to help you understand why certain changes are necessary." These conversations would last for hours, with Arthur speaking in the patient, reasonable tone of someone explaining complex concepts to a slow child. He would catalog my failures as a wife meals that were slightly under-seasoned laundry, that wasn't folded with mathematical precision social interactions, where I had failed to demonstrate proper deference to his superior judgment. I'm not telling you these things to be cruel. He would explain, his hand resting gently on my knee in a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to an outside observer. I'm trying to help you become the woman you're capable of being, but that requires you to acknowledge your limitations and trust my guidance completely. The conversations always ended with detailed instructions about how I could improve my performance, followed by Arthur's gentle but firm expectation that I would thank him for his patience and promise to do better. I learned to apologize quickly and completely, to accept responsibility for failures I hadn't committed, and to express gratitude for correction that left me feeling smaller and more worthless each time. Beatrice reinforced these lessons during her daily visits, arriving each morning with the punctuality of a factory supervisor and the watchful attention of someone conducting a crucial inspection. She had developed an uncanny ability to identify microscopic flaws in my housekeeping failures, so small that I wouldn't have noticed them myself, but so significant in her assessment that they required immediate correction. "Eleanor, dear," she observed one November morning, running her finger along the top of a picture frame in our living room. "I can see that your dusting technique needs refinement. A properly maintained home requires attention to details that others might overlook." She would then demonstrate the correct method, which differed from my technique in ways so subtle they seemed arbitrary, while explaining how my carelessness reflected poorly on the entire Hartwell family reputation. "When Arthur brings colleagues or clients to this house, they notice everything," she would say, watching me redust surfaces that had appeared spotless moments before. "A successful man requires a wife who understands that excellence in small things leads to excellence in all things." But Beatrice's most effective weapon was her gift for psychological manipulation disguised as maternal concern. She would bring up my family background in ways that seemed supportive, but were actually designed to reinforce my sense of social inadequacy. "I know this is challenging for you, dear," she would say while watching me struggle to meet some impossible standard of domestic perfection. "Your mother did the best she could with limited resources and education, but she simply couldn't provide you with the training necessary for maintaining a household of this caliber. It's not anyone's fault, but it does mean you have to work twice as hard to overcome those early disadvantages." The constant criticism gradually convinced me that I was indeed failing in my most basic responsibilities as a wife. I began to doubt my own perceptions, my own memories, my own competence in even the simplest tasks. When Arthur flew into rages over perceived slights or mistakes, I found myself genuinely believing that I had somehow provoked his anger through my own inadequacies. My attempts to seek help from outside our household only reinforced my growing sense of isolation and helplessness. When I finally gathered the courage to speak with Pastor Williams about my marriage difficulties, his response was exactly what Arthur and Beatrice had probably predicted. "Eleanor, my dear child," he said, folding his weathered hands in his lap as we sat in his study, surrounded by theological texts and biblical quotations. "Marriage is indeed one of life's greatest challenges, especially for young people who enter into it with unrealistic expectations about what love actually requires." I had prepared carefully for this conversation, choosing my words to convey the seriousness of my situation without seeming hysterical or dramatic. "Pastor, I'm concerned about Arthur's methods of guidance. Sometimes when he's been drinking, he becomes quite harsh in his corrections. He struck me on several occasions, and I'm not certain that such behavior is appropriate between husband and wife." Pastor Williams' expression grew troubled, but not in the way I had hoped. "Eleanor, I've known Arthur since he was baptized in this very church as an infant. He's a good man, a pillar of our community devoted to his family and his faith. Perhaps the difficulty lies not with his methods of guidance, but with your response to that guidance. He opened his Bible to passages I had heard countless times before, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced sermon. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. A wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears it down. But surely, I interrupted desperately, God doesn't intend for marriages to involve violence or cruelty. When Arthur drinks, he becomes someone different, someone who says terrible things and uses his physical strength to frighten me into compliance. Pastor Williams's smile was gentle but firm. Eleanor, sometimes a husband must correct his wife firmly, just as a loving father must sometimes discipline a wayward child. The Bible tells us that those who spare the rod spoil the child, and the same principle applies to all relationships where God has established authority and submission. I left the parsonage feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. If the church, the institution I had trusted to provide moral guidance and protection for the vulnerable, wouldn't help me, then perhaps the problem really was with my own understanding of what marriage should be. My phone call to Mama was even more devastating, though for different reasons that revealed the true scope of Arthur's manipulation. Eleanor, honey. Her voice crackled through the long-distance connection, weighted with a disappointment that cut through me like a blade. You can't keep calling us every time you have a disagreement with Arthur. Marriage requires adjustment, and it's not fair to expect your husband to cater to every little complaint or concern. Mama, this isn't about small disagreements. I tried to explain, my words tumbling over each other in desperation. Arthur has been drinking heavily, and when he drinks, he becomes violent. He's hit me several times, and he says cruel things about our family, about how I'm not sophisticated enough to be worthy of his status. The silence that followed stretched so long, I wondered if the connection had been lost. When Mama finally spoke, her voice carried a strange, careful quality that I had never heard before. Eleanor's sweetheart Arthur called us just last week to express his concern about your emotional difficulties. He's been very patient, but he's worried that you're having trouble adjusting to the responsibilities of being his wife. The floor seemed to disappear beneath my feet as I realized how completely Arthur had outmaneuvered me. He hadn't just isolated me from potential sources of help, he had actively poisoned those sources against me, presenting himself as the long-suffering husband of a troubled and ungrateful wife. He mentioned that you've been making wild accusations, claiming that he's mistreating you when he's actually been extraordinarily patient with your adjustment difficulties. Mama continued, apparently oblivious to how completely she had betrayed her own daughter. Honey, Arthur Hartwell is the most eligible man in 3 counties. The fact that he chose you, that he saw something special in our family, is a blessing beyond anything we ever dared hope for. The conversation ended with Mama's gentle but firm instruction that I should focus on being grateful for my good fortune, rather than looking for problems where none existed. She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the devastating realization that I was completely alone. That evening, Arthur arrived home carrying flowers and chocolates, his manner bright with the kind of affectionate attention he had shown during our courtship. I thought my beautiful wife deserved a little surprise, he said, kissing my uninjured cheek with gentle warmth. I know I've been working long hours lately, and I wanted to show you how much I appreciate all the effort you put into making our home perfect for me. The whiplash between cruelty and kindness was more disorienting than consistent abuse would have been. Just when I thought I understood the rules of our relationship, Arthur would transform into the loving husband I had married, making me question whether the violence and psychological torture were real or products of my own overwrought imagination. You look tired, darling, he observed, guiding me to our living room sofa and settling beside me with apparent concern. Have you been taking proper care of yourself? Eating regularly? Getting enough sleep? I worry that the responsibilities of marriage might be overwhelming for someone so young and inexperienced. I found myself apologizing for my appearance, promising to take better care of myself, genuinely grateful for his attention despite everything that had happened between us. The combination of isolation criticism and intermittent kindness was systematically breaking down my ability to trust my own perceptions or maintain any sense of independent identity. But even as I played the role of grateful wife, accepting Arthur's gifts and thanking him for his thoughtfulness, a small part of my mind remained detached and analytical. The books I had read about criminal psychology were providing me with a framework for understanding what was happening to me, even if I wasn't yet strong enough to act on that knowledge. Arthur's behavior followed classic patterns of psychological manipulation, isolation from support systems, alternating punishment and reward, constant criticism designed to erode self-esteem, and gradual normalization of increasingly extreme abuse. Recognizing these patterns didn't make them less effective, but it did help me maintain some connection to objective reality. During my weekly shopping trips to town, the only freedom I was still permitted, I began visiting the library again, using my remaining independence to research topics that might prove useful in ways I couldn't yet articulate. I read about legal procedures for divorce, about women's shelters in distant cities, about investigative techniques and evidence-gathering methods that police use to solve complex cases. Most importantly, I made a decision that would prove crucial to my eventual escape. Using a false name and address, I rented a small post office box in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls, creating a secret mailing address where I could receive information without Arthur or Beatrice's knowledge. I told myself it was just a precaution, a way to maintain some tiny piece of independence in a life that was increasingly controlled by their demands. I had no specific plans for using it, no conscious strategy for escape or resistance. But some part of me, the part that had studied criminal cases and investigative methods, was already preparing for a war I hadn't yet decided to fight. The shy girl who had read about methodology and evidence gathering as intellectual curiosities was slowly being replaced by someone harder and more calculating. Someone who understood that survival might require adopting the same ruthless methods that were being used against her. The transformation was painful, but it was also the beginning of my salvation. Every act of cruelty was teaching me valuable lessons about deception, manipulation, and the patient accumulation of power. Arthur and Beatrice thought they were breaking me down, but they were actually forging me into something far more dangerous than they could imagine. Winter descended on Millbrook like a gray shroud, trapping us all inside with our carefully maintained secrets and our slowly festering hatred. The abuse that had begun as isolated incidents of Arthur's correction evolved into a systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to erase every trace of the woman I had once been. By December, Arthur's drinking had become as predictable as the sunrise, and with it came increasingly sophisticated forms of torture that revealed a level of sadistic creativity I hadn't suspected he possessed. He had discovered my claustrophobia, a terror of enclosed spaces that dated back to childhood, and began using it as his primary weapon against my spirit. "Eleanor needs some quiet time to think about her behavior," he would announce to Beatrice after manufacturing some excuse for punishment. Then he would force me into progressively smaller spaces. First the bedroom closet, then the hall linen cabinet, finally the cramped space beneath our kitchen sink, where he would leave me for hours while he and his mother discussed my treatment, in voices loud enough for me to hear every word. But Arthur's most devastating discovery was the way I could be broken down through seemingly gentle conversations that revealed the depth of his manipulation of everyone around me. "Your mother called today," he mentioned casually one snowy evening, settling into his chair with a glass of bourbon while I prepared dinner with hands that shook from my latest confinement. "She wanted to thank me again for being so patient with your ongoing difficulties. Apparently your father is quite concerned about the financial burden your instability might place on their retirement plans." He would let that information settle like poison in my bloodstream before continuing with details designed to maximize my anguish. "They're so grateful that I'm willing to provide the kind of guidance and structure you obviously require. Your father specifically asked me to do whatever is necessary to help you become the kind of wife who brings honor to her family rather than embarrassment. These revelations were always delivered in Arthur's most reasonable, sympathetic tone, as if he were sharing unfortunate news rather than deliberately inflicting psychological wounds. The casual cruelty of using my parents' love against me became one of his favorite weapons deployed whenever he sensed that my resistance was beginning to recover. But it was Beatrice who proved to be the true architect of my destruction, orchestrating my daily humiliation with the methodical precision of someone who had perfected these techniques through years of practice. She arrived each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, armed with a leather-bound notebook where she recorded every aspect of my domestic performance. The notebook contained detailed assessments of my cooking, cleaning, and social behavior, along with specific recommendations for improvement that became increasingly impossible to achieve. "I'm afraid yesterday's performance was quite disappointing," she would announce, settling into her chair with the air of a judge delivering a verdict. "The breakfast eggs were overcooked by perhaps 30 seconds, there were water spots on the crystal that hadn't been properly dried, and your posture during Mr. Henderson's visit suggested a lack of respect for our family's social obligations." She would then spend the next 2 hours making me repeat whatever tasks had been deemed inadequate, standing over me like a prison guard while I tried desperately to meet standards that seemed to shift with her moods. A Hartwell wife must be beyond reproach in all things. She would lecture as I re-ironed shirts that appeared perfectly pressed to my untrained eye. "When Arthur brings business associates to this house, they notice every detail, every speck of dust, every wrinkle in the linens, every sign that his wife might not be worthy of his distinguished position in the community." But Beatrice's true genius lay in her ability to make me complicit in my own destruction through carefully orchestrated social situations that highlighted my inadequacies while reinforcing her position as the family matriarch. She began hosting weekly tea parties in our parlor, inviting the most prominent women in Millbrook for afternoon gatherings, where I was expected to serve as both hostess and exhibition of my own failures. These events were masterpieces of social manipulation designed to make me feel grateful for humiliation, while convincing the other women that Beatrice was performing an act of Christian charity by helping her tragically incompetent daughter-in-law. "Poor Eleanor tries so very hard," Beatrice would say with a sympathetic smile as I struggled to serve tea without spilling, "but she simply wasn't raised with the same standards we maintain in established families. Her mother, bless her heart, did her best with limited resources, but there's only so much that can be accomplished when proper training is lacking." The other women would nod with understanding, their eyes full of pity that felt like acid on my skin. I was becoming a character in their ongoing social drama, the unfortunate girl who had married above her station and was struggling pitifully to adapt to circumstances beyond her natural capabilities. "We must all be patient with Eleanor," Mrs. Henderson would murmur, accepting her perfectly prepared cup of tea while studiously avoiding eye contact with me. "Learning to maintain a household of this caliber requires years of experience, and some girls simply need more guidance than others." My attempts to participate in these conversations were systematically undermined by Beatrice's subtle but constant corrections. If I expressed an opinion about community events, she would gently suggest that I might not fully understand the complexities involved. If I tried to contribute to discussions about homemaking, she would redirect the conversation to highlight my inexperience or my family's modest background. "Eleanor has such enthusiastic ideas," she would say with maternal fondness, "but enthusiasm must be tempered with wisdom and experience before it can be truly useful." The psychological isolation was more effective than physical confinement would have been. I was surrounded by people who knew me, who had watched me grow up in their community, but I had become invisible to them as anything other than an object of pity or an example of social climbing gone wrong. But the most devastating blow came during one of Arthur's increasingly frequent business dinners, when I overheard a conversation that revealed the true scope of their criminal activities and my role in concealing them. Arthur had begun bringing clients to our house for what he called working meals, elaborate dinners where business was discussed in the relaxed atmosphere of our dining room. while I served course after course with the invisible efficiency of well-trained household staff. It was during one of these dinners in late January that I first learned about the systematic theft that was funding our comfortable lifestyle. I was serving dessert when Arthur's guest, a nervous-looking farmer named Harrison, expressed concerns about discrepancies in his account ledgers. The numbers don't quite add up, Arthur. Harrison was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. I've gone over the books 3 times, and I'm showing expenses that I don't remember authorizing. Arthur's response was smooth and reassuring, delivered with the professional confidence that had made him so successful at gaining his clients' trust. Harold, you're worrying about phantom problems that exist only in your imagination. My accounting methods may be more sophisticated than what you're accustomed to, but they're designed to maximize your profits while minimizing your tax obligations. From my position in the kitchen where I was preparing coffee service, I could hear every word of their conversation through the thin wall that separated the rooms. Arthur was explaining how certain consulting fees and equipment expenses were actually methods for moving money through accounts in ways that would be invisible to casual audits, but would generate substantial returns for his most valued clients. The beauty of this system, Arthur continued, his voice warm with professional pride, is that it creates paper trails that satisfy government oversight while providing flexibility for the kind of financial planning that truly successful men require. What I was hearing wasn't sophisticated accounting. It was systematic fraud, carefully designed to steal from some clients while appearing to benefit others. Arthur was running a complex embezzlement scheme that used his position of trust to redistribute wealth according to his own calculations of who deserved to profit and who deserved to be victimized. But the most chilling revelation came when Harrison expressed concerns about the legal implications of these accounting innovations. What happens if someone notices the discrepancies? He asked. What if Miller or one of the others starts asking questions about where their money is actually going? Arthur's laugh was cold and confident. David Miller trusts me completely, has for years. He sees his bottom-line profits and assumes I'm simply more skilled than other accountants at maximizing efficiency. Even if he did start asking questions, who would believe that Arthur Hartwell, pillar of the community, devoted husband and son, would risk everything to steal from his friends and neighbors? The implication was clear. Arthur's reputation for respectability, carefully maintained through years of public service and social prominence, was actually a disguise that made his crimes invisible to potential investigators. His marriage to me, his devotion to his mother, his participation in church and community activities, all of it was camouflage for criminal activities that had been generating illegal income for years. As the evening progressed, I learned that Arthur wasn't just stealing money, he was systematically destroying the financial security of families throughout our community, using their trust in his expertise to cover theft that would eventually bankrupt some of his victims. More importantly, I discovered that Beatrice was far more than a passive beneficiary of Arthur's crimes. She was actively involved in laundering the stolen money through various accounts and investments, using her position as a respected community leader to provide legitimacy for transactions that would otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. Mother has been invaluable in managing the more delicate aspects of our financial arrangements, Arthur told Harrison with obvious pride. Her social connections provide opportunities for investment strategies that wouldn't be available to someone operating independently. After Harrison left, I lay awake in our bedroom, listening to Arthur and Beatrice discuss their criminal enterprise with the casual efficiency of business partners reviewing quarterly reports. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past several years, building a secret fortune while maintaining the appearance of modest respectability that made their crimes unthinkable to their victims and neighbors. But their conversation also revealed something even more disturbing. I wasn't Arthur's first wife to discover their secret, and I wouldn't be the first to disappear permanently if they decided I had become a liability. Margaret became quite troublesome toward the end, Beatrice observed, referring to Arthur's first wife in the tone she might use to discuss an inconvenient household problem. She started asking questions about the bank statements, wanting to understand why we had so much money when Arthur's legitimate income couldn't possibly support our lifestyle. The drowning was unfortunate but necessary, Arthur replied with chilling matter-of-factness. She had already started talking to people, expressing suspicions that could have destroyed everything we've built. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made to protect the greater good. Margaret's death hadn't been an accident. It had been murder carefully planned and executed to eliminate a witness who threatened their criminal activities. And from the way they spoke about it, I realized that they were already discussing similar solutions for dealing with me if I became too much of a problem. The next morning, Beatrice's usual inspection of my housekeeping took on new significance as I recognized it for what it really was: surveillance designed to assess whether I was becoming too observant, too knowledgeable, too dangerous to their continued security. "You seem distracted lately, Eleanor," she observed, watching me dust picture frames with the careful attention of someone looking for signs of suspicious behavior. "Arthur mentioned that you've been asking more questions about his business activities. Curiosity can be a dangerous trait in wives who don't understand the complexities of their husband's professional obligations." The threat was delivered with Beatrice's usual maternal gentleness, but its meaning was unmistakable. I was being warned to stop paying attention to things that weren't my concern, or face the same fate that had befallen Margaret. But their warning came too late. I had already begun the process that would eventually destroy them both, gathering evidence and building resources they didn't know I possessed. The frightened, compliant wife they saw each day was becoming an elaborate disguise for someone far more dangerous. Someone who understood that survival required becoming as ruthless and calculating as the enemies she faced. The war was escalating, and I was finally ready to fight back with weapons they had taught me to use. The revelation that transformed me from victim to predator came on a cold morning in March, when I discovered documents that revealed not just the scope of Arthur and Beatrice's criminal enterprise, but their specific plans for eliminating me as a potential threat to their security. I was cleaning our bedroom when I found the papers hidden beneath Arthur's side of the mattress, documents that had been carefully prepared, but never filed, dated 3 weeks earlier, and bearing the official seal of Dr. Morrison's medical practice. My hands trembled as I read words that spelled out my fate with clinical precision. Psychiatric Evaluation Report. Eleanor Hartwell. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of severe melancholia with paranoid delusions. Subject claims that family members are plotting against her and stealing money from community members. These accusations, which have no basis in reality, appear to be manifestations of a deteriorating mental condition that poses potential danger to herself and others. Recommend immediate commitment to state hospital for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. Patient's condition appears to be deteriorating rapidly and may require long-term institutional care. The report was signed by Dr. Morrison and countersigned by 2 other physicians I didn't recognize, but it was accompanied by additional documents that made the scope of their conspiracy horrifyingly clear. There were commitment papers already prepared for my signature financial documents, transferring all marital assets to Arthur's sole control, and most chilling of all, a will supposedly written in my own handwriting that left everything to Arthur in the event of my tragic suicide during a period of mental instability. They weren't just planning to abuse me into submission, they were preparing to have me declared insane and institutionalized, permanently removing me as a witness to their crimes, while gaining complete control over any assets or knowledge that might threaten them. But as I studied the documents more carefully, examining the forged handwriting and the fabricated medical evidence with the analytical skills I had developed through years of reading detective stories and legal texts, I realized that Arthur and Beatrice had made several crucial mistakes in their planning. The will was written in script that resembled mine, but contained subtle differences in letter formation and spacing that a careful analysis would reveal as forgery. The medical evidence they had fabricated included symptoms and incidents that could be easily contradicted by anyone who took the time to investigate thoroughly, dates when I had supposedly exhibited violent behavior that coincided with church services I had attended publicly, witnesses to my erratic conduct who could be proven to have been out of town during the alleged incidents. Most importantly, they had underestimated both my intelligence and my resourcefulness, assuming that months of systematic abuse had broken my spirit completely and left me incapable of mounting effective resistance to their plans. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The shock of finding their conspiracy documents triggered something inside me that felt like awakening from a long, drugged sleep. The terrified, compliant wife who had endured their abuse for nearly a year died in that moment, replaced by someone colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than either Arthur or Beatrice could imagine. I wasn't going to be their victim anymore. I was going to be their destruction. That afternoon, while Arthur was at his office and Beatrice was attending one of her charity meetings, I began implementing a plan that had been forming in the depths of my subconscious for months without my conscious awareness. Every book I had read about criminal investigation, every observation I had made about their routines and weaknesses, every piece of evidence I had inadvertently gathered about their illegal activities, all of it came together into a strategy designed not just to ensure my escape, but to destroy them as completely as they had tried to destroy me. The first step was securing additional evidence of their crimes. Using lock-picking techniques I had learned from that library manual, I gained access to Arthur's home office and spent 3 hours photographing every document in his private files. The strongbox contained not just records of his embezzlement schemes, but correspondence with other criminals' bank statements showing the movement of stolen money and detailed plans for expanding their network to include several other prominent businessmen in the region. But my real breakthrough came when I discovered Beatrice's personal hiding place, a loose floorboard in her bedroom that concealed records she had been keeping of their criminal partnership. These documents revealed that she wasn't just a passive participant in Arthur's schemes, but the actual mastermind behind much of their criminal activity. Beatrice had been using her position as a respected community leader to identify wealthy targets for Arthur's embezzlement operations. She had also been running her own parallel schemes using her charitable activities as cover for sophisticated money laundering operations that had been generating illegal income for nearly 5 years. The scope of their crimes was staggering. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from clients, charities, and community organizations, building a secret fortune that dwarfed anything their legitimate income could have provided. But more important than the money was what I found buried deeper in Beatrice's files evidence that they had done this before to other women with lethal consequences. There were newspaper clippings about 3 previous accidents involving young women who had been married to or associated with men in their criminal network. Margaret, Arthur's first wife, had drowned in what was officially ruled an accident, but Beatrice's notes revealed that Margaret had been asking questions about discrepancies in their financial records just weeks before her death. But Margaret wasn't their only victim. There was Sarah Coleman, whose husband had been one of Arthur's early criminal partners, who had died in a house fire after expressing suspicions about her husband's sudden wealth. And Jennifer Walsh, a young bank teller, who had noticed irregularities in some of Arthur's transactions, who had been found dead from an apparent drug overdose, despite having no history of substance abuse. I was looking at evidence of a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years, eliminating witnesses and potential threats with methodical efficiency, while maintaining perfect facades of respectability and community service. Most chilling of all was a detailed timeline that showed how each woman's mental breakdown had been carefully orchestrated in the months before her death. Social isolation, systematic psychological abuse, gradual poisoning of their relationships with family and friends, and finally the dramatic collapse that justified either commitment to mental institutions or provided cover for their elimination. I was following the exact same pattern that had led to Margaret's murder, and if I didn't act quickly and decisively, I would meet the same fate within a matter of weeks. But their previous success had made them overconfident and careless. They had documented their crimes with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all their activities, creating a comprehensive record of criminal behavior that would ensure their convictions if it ever fell into the hands of law enforcement. Armed with this knowledge, I began the most dangerous phase of my counterattack. Using the false identity I had established when renting my secret post office box, I wrote detailed letters to 3 different law enforcement agencies: the county sheriff, the state attorney general, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, outlining the evidence of Arthur and Beatrice's crimes and providing specific information about where additional proof could be found. But I didn't mail the letters immediately. Instead, I used my knowledge of their routines and their criminal network to time the delivery of my evidence for maximum impact, ensuring that multiple investigations would begin simultaneously and prevent them from covering their tracks or eliminating witnesses. The second part of my strategy involved creating evidence of their conspiracy to have me falsely committed while building a legal foundation for my eventual testimony against them. I documented the forged commitment papers, photographed the medical records they had fabricated, and most crucially began secretly recording their conversations about my supposed mental illness. Using a small recording device I had purchased during one of my shopping trips, a device so new that most people weren't familiar with its capabilities, I captured hours of audio evidence that proved their conspiracy to have me declared insane as cover for their criminal activities. But the most important element of my plan involved psychological manipulation techniques I had learned by observing their methods. I began displaying symptoms of the mental breakdown they were trying to fabricate, but in ways that would actually strengthen my legal position when the time came to expose their crimes. I started keeping a detailed diary of their abuse, written in the style of someone struggling with depression, but maintaining enough clarity to document specific dates, times, and details that could be verified through independent investigation. I made sure to leave this diary where Arthur and Beatrice would find it, knowing that they would see it as confirmation of my deteriorating mental state, rather than recognizing it as evidence that would ultimately convict them. I also began reaching out to potential allies in ways that appeared desperate and confused, but actually established a paper trail of my attempts to seek help. I wrote letters to distant relatives, made carefully planned phone calls to social service organizations, and even contacted a lawyer in Indianapolis, all while playing the role of a woman whose grip on reality was slipping, but who still possessed enough coherence to provide detailed, accurate information about her circumstances. The final element of my strategy was the most dangerous. I had to make Arthur and Beatrice believe that their plan was working perfectly, that I was indeed breaking down mentally, and would soon be ready for institutionalization. This required me to walk a razor-thin line between appearing genuinely disturbed and maintaining enough hidden strength to implement my escape when the moment came. I began spending hours each day sitting motionless in our parlor, staring at the wall with vacant eyes while my mind raced through calculations and contingencies. I stopped responding to Arthur's questions except with single words, started forgetting to complete household tasks, and began displaying the kind of catatonic behavior that would support their claims about my mental incapacity. Arthur and Beatrice were delighted with what they perceived as my rapid deterioration. They began discussing their plans more openly in my presence, confident that I was too far gone to understand or remember what they were saying. "She'll be ready for commitment within the month," Beatrice observed one evening, speaking about me as if I were a piece of furniture rather than a human being sitting 3 feet away. "Dr. Morrison has already prepared the final paperwork, and I've made arrangements with the hospital administrators. They're expecting a new patient with severe depression and violent tendencies." "What about the financial arrangements?" Arthur asked. "Have you completed the asset transfer documents?" "Everything is in order," Beatrice assured him with satisfaction. "Once Eleanor is institutionalized, you'll have complete control over all marital property and assets. And if her condition deteriorates further, which these cases often do, the hospital has procedures for handling patients who become too difficult to manage." They were discussing my imprisonment and probable murder with the casual efficiency of people planning a dinner party, confident that their careful preparation had made detection impossible and resistance futile. But every word they spoke was being recorded by the device I had hidden in our parlor, creating an audio record of their conspiracy that would provide prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of their crimes. The trap was set, the evidence was gathered, and all that remained was to wait for the perfect moment to spring my counterattack. Arthur and Beatrice thought they were watching the final collapse of my sanity, but what they were actually witnessing was the birth of their own destruction, carefully orchestrated by the woman they had tried so hard to break, but had instead transformed into something far more dangerous than they could possibly comprehend. The frightened girl, who had believed in fairy tale endings, was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes justice requires becoming the very thing you're fighting against, cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless in pursuit of survival. My carefully orchestrated performance of mental collapse proved so convincing that Arthur and Beatrice accelerated their timeline for having me committed, moving from their original plan of gradual deterioration to immediate crisis intervention when they decided I had become an imminent threat to their security. The catalyst for their panic was an incident I had staged with mathematical precision, designed to convince them that my breakdown had reached the point where institutional care could no longer be delayed. On a cold Thursday morning in late March, I allowed them to discover me in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, holding one of our carving knives, while apparently engaged in an animated conversation with invisible people. She was talking to Margaret. Arthur reported to Dr. Morrison the next day, his voice tight with what sounded like genuine fear, but was actually relief that his problem was about to be solved permanently. She kept saying, "I know what you did to her, and she's trying to warn me about something." When I tried to take the knife away from her, she looked right through me as if I weren't there. The incident I had described was complete fabrication, but Arthur's interpretation fit perfectly with their narrative about my deteriorating mental state. More importantly, his mention of Margaret, his murdered first wife, revealed how deeply my psychological warfare was affecting their confidence. Dr. Morrison arrived within hours, accompanied by 2 orderlies from the county hospital and carrying commitment papers that had been prepared in advance. His examination was perfunctory, designed to confirm a diagnosis that had already been decided rather than to assess my actual mental condition. "Eleanor, dear," he said, gently settling into the chair across from where I sat in our parlor, with my hands folded and my eyes fixed on the wall. "Your family is very concerned about you. They tell me you've been experiencing some difficulties lately, seeing things that aren't there, having conversations with people who can't respond." I maintained my catatonic pose while he conducted what amounted to a performance, rather than a medical evaluation, responding to his questions with the minimal disconnected answers that supported their fabricated evidence of my mental incapacity. But beneath my blank exterior, I was memorizing every detail of the process, gathering evidence that would later prove their conspiracy to have me falsely imprisoned. The diagnosis is quite clear," Dr. Morrison announced to Arthur and Beatrice after completing his predetermined assessment. "Eleanor is suffering from acute psychosis with paranoid delusions and potential for violence. Without immediate intervention in a controlled environment, her condition will almost certainly deteriorate into complete catatonia or explosive violence." "Oh, what kind of treatment are we discussing?" Arthur asked, his voice carefully modulated to suggest reluctant acceptance of a family tragedy. "The state hospital has excellent facilities for patients with Eleanor's condition," Dr. Morrison explained with professional confidence. "Complete isolation from environmental stresses, supervised medication, and intensive therapy designed to address the underlying psychological trauma that appears to be driving her breakdown." The way he emphasized complete isolation and intensive therapy made it clear that I was being sentenced to what amounted to indefinite imprisonment in an institution where inconvenient women disappeared quietly, their protests dismissed as the ravings of diseased minds. But Arthur and Beatrice had made a crucial error in their rush to eliminate me as a threat. In their eagerness to have me committed immediately, they had failed to notice that my apparent mental breakdown had not prevented me from completing one final devastating preparation for their destruction. 2 days earlier, while they were both occupied with making arrangements for my institutionalization, I had mailed the letters that would destroy their lives. Not just the detailed evidence of their crimes that I had sent to law enforcement agencies, but copies of their conspiracy documents to investigative journalists, to Arthur's business rivals, and to several of their victims who had the resources and motivation to demand justice. I had also completed the most dangerous element of my plan using Arthur's own keys and security codes. I had gained access to their safe deposit box at First National Bank and photographed additional evidence that revealed the full scope of their criminal network. The materials I found there documented not just their individual crimes, but their connections to a regional conspiracy that involved corruption in law enforcement, local government, and the judicial system. The evidence was so comprehensive, so carefully documented, that their convictions would be inevitable once it reached the proper authorities. But more immediately, I needed to survive the next few hours without being transported to an institution where I might disappear permanently before my evidence could be acted upon. The commitment hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving me a weekend to complete my preparations while maintaining the illusion that I was completely helpless and unaware of their plans. Arthur and Beatrice spent those days in a state of barely controlled excitement, discussing their arrangements with the careless confidence of people who believed their victory was assured. Once Eleanor is safely hospitalized, we can begin implementing the South American contingency plans, Beatrice told Arthur as they sat in our kitchen on Saturday evening, apparently convinced that I was too far gone to understand their conversation. The accounts in Buenos Aires are fully established, and our contacts there have confirmed that new identities will be available within 6 months. What about the local assets? Arthur asked. And the remaining business obligations? Everything will be liquidated gradually over the next year, Beatrice explained with the satisfaction of someone who had planned every detail. By the time anyone realizes the scope of what we've accomplished, we'll be living comfortably in a country that doesn't extradite financial criminals to the United States. They had stolen enough money to live luxuriously for the rest of their lives, eliminated me as the only remaining witness who could connect them to their crimes, and prepared escape routes that would allow them to disappear completely if their activities were ever discovered. In their minds, they had achieved the perfect crime. What they didn't know was that their perfect crime was about to become their perfect destruction. The first crack in their facade appeared on Sunday afternoon when Arthur's business partner James Morrison arrived at our house in a state of barely controlled fury. I watched from our living room window as he stormed up our front walk, his face flushed with the kind of rage that comes from discovering you've been systematically betrayed by someone you trusted completely. "Arthur," he shouted, pounding on our front door with enough force to rattle the windows throughout the house. "Open this door right now, you lying, stealing piece of garbage." Arthur's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of confusion or surprise, his face went pale with the expression of someone whose worst fears had just been confirmed. He knew exactly why James was there, which meant he knew his crimes had been exposed. "Stay here and keep quiet," he commanded Beatrice in a harsh whisper, then walked to the front door with the careful composure of a man trying to control a situation that had already spiraled beyond his influence. From my position in the parlor, pretending to stare catatonically at the wall while actually listening to every word I could hear, the confrontation that followed. "James, what's this about? You seem upset about something." "Upset?" James's voice carried the kind of cold fury that precedes violence. "I'm about to beat you to death with my bare hands, you thieving bastard. Did you really think I wouldn't discover that you've been stealing from my accounts for the past 3 years?" "I don't understand what you're talking about," Arthur replied, but his voice lacked conviction and carried the desperate quality of someone whose lies were crumbling under scrutiny. "If there's been some kind of accounting error," roar. James's laugh was harsh and bitter. $47,000 in phantom expenses and inflated invoices isn't an error, Arthur. It's systematic theft, and I have the documentation to prove every penny you stole from me. The conversation that followed revealed that James had indeed received and acted upon the anonymous letter I had sent him, conducting a thorough audit of his accounts that had uncovered evidence of Arthur's embezzlement. But more damaging than the financial crimes was what James had discovered about the scope of Arthur's criminal network. "I've already contacted David Miller Harrison and the others." James continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "Every one of your clients is conducting emergency audits, and the FBI has opened a formal investigation into your business practices. You're finished, Arthur. Completely and permanently finished." Arthur's desperate attempts to negotiate or explain were cut short by James's final devastating revelation. "And in case you're thinking about running, you should know that federal agents have already frozen every account you thought was secret. Every penny you stole is being recovered with interest and penalties that will leave you bankrupt for the rest of your miserable life." After James left, Arthur and Beatrice spent the remainder of Sunday in frantic consultation, their voices rising with panic as they realized the comprehensive nature of their exposure. Their perfect criminal enterprise was collapsing around them, and they had no idea that I was the architect of their destruction. How did he find out? Beatrice kept asking, her usual composure shattered by the realization that decades of careful planning were unraveling. "We were so careful, so thorough in covering our tracks. Someone must have provided him with inside information." "It has to be someone who knew about our methods," Arthur replied, his voice tight with paranoia. "Someone who had access to our records, who understood how our system worked well enough to point investigators in exactly the right direction. They suspected everyone: former employees, rival businessmen, dissatisfied criminal partners, but never once did they consider that their broken, helpless victim might have been capable of orchestrating their downfall with such devastating precision." Monday morning brought the final phase of their destruction, and with it, the most dangerous moment of my entire ordeal. Arthur and Beatrice had decided that my commitment could no longer wait for the scheduled hearing they needed to eliminate me as a potential witness immediately before the expanding investigation could uncover evidence of my murder. "We're taking Eleanor to the hospital this morning," Arthur announced to Dr. Morrison when he arrived for what was supposed to be a routine pre-commitment consultation. "Her condition deteriorated dramatically over the weekend, and I'm afraid she's become an immediate danger to herself and others." What followed was the most terrifying hour of my life, as they attempted to have me forcibly removed from our house before the evidence of their crimes could fully surface. But their desperation made them careless, and their carelessness gave me the opening I needed to complete my transformation from victim to victor. As Dr. Morrison prepared to sedate me for transport to the state hospital, I allowed my carefully maintained facade of helplessness to slip just enough to reveal the intelligence and calculation that had been hidden beneath it. "You're not taking me anywhere," I said quietly, my voice carrying a strength and clarity that made all three of them freeze in shock. "Because by now, the FBI has received the complete evidence I sent them about your embezzlement schemes, and the state attorney general is reviewing your conspiracy to have me falsely committed." The look of dawning horror on their faces was worth every moment of suffering I had endured over the past year. They had spent months systematically breaking me down, confident that they had destroyed my spirit completely and left me incapable of resistance. Instead, they had created their own destroyer, and I was about to demonstrate exactly how thoroughly they had underestimated their victim. The moment I spoke those words, Arthur's carefully constructed world began collapsing with the speed and violence of a controlled demolition. But instead of the paralyzed shock I had expected, his response revealed the true depths of his desperation and the lethal lengths to which he was prepared to go to silence me permanently. His reaction was immediate and savage, a backhand slap that sent me reeling into our hallway wall with enough force to split my lip and fill my mouth with the metallic taste of blood. But instead of the cowering compliance he had trained me to display, I met his eyes with steady defiance that reflected none of the fear he was accustomed to seeing there. "You clever little bitch!" He snarled, his facade of civilized respectability finally stripped away completely to reveal the monster beneath. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been pretending to be the broken little wife while you plotted against us? Long enough, I replied, wiping blood from my lip with deliberate calm. Long enough to gather evidence of every crime you've committed, every life you've destroyed, every murder you've covered up. I know about Margaret Arthur. I know about Sarah Coleman and Jennifer Walsh. I know about all of them. The mention of his previous victims hit him like physical blows, each name causing his face to grow paler and his breathing more labored. Beatrice, who had been standing frozen in our doorway, finally found her voice in a shriek of pure rage and terror. "That's impossible!" she screamed, her composure shattered beyond repair. "You've been catatonic for weeks. You didn't have access to what?" I interrupted, allowing genuine satisfaction to color my voice for the first time in months. "To your records, to Arthur's safe deposit box, to the correspondence you thought was so carefully hidden." I reached into my dress pocket and withdrew a small key, not just Arthur's strongbox key, but copies of every key they had thought was secure, duplicated, during the months when they believed I was too broken to be capable of such planning. "I've been watching you both for almost a year." I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Learning your routines, memorizing your weaknesses, documenting every crime you've committed. You thought you were training me to be helpless, but you were actually teaching me everything I needed to know to destroy you." Dr. Morrison, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, finally found his voice. "Eleanor, you're clearly having some kind of psychotic episode. These delusions about criminal conspiracies and murders, are you part of this too, Doctor?" I asked, turning to face him with eyes that held none of the vacant confusion he expected to see. "Did you know they were planning to have me murdered like Margaret? Or are you just another useful fool who believed their lies about my mental condition?" Before he could answer, the sound of car doors slamming in our driveway announced the arrival of visitors who would transform our domestic confrontation into a federal crime scene. Through our front windows, I could see multiple black sedans and enough law enforcement officers to arrest a small army of criminals. "And that would be the FBI," I observed with satisfaction that felt like honey on my tongue. "I sent them quite detailed information about your activities, along with photographs of your records and recorded conversations about your plans to eliminate me. They've probably been watching this house for days, waiting for the right moment to collect their evidence." Arthur's response was the desperate violence of a cornered animal. He lunged toward me with his hands extended, apparently intending to strangle me before the authorities could take him into custody. But months of anticipating his movements had prepared me for this moment. I stepped aside and brought my knee up into his solar plexus, with all the force I could muster, doubling him over and leaving him gasping for breath on our hallway floor. Beatrice's reaction was more calculated but equally desperate. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small pistol, her hands shaking as she pointed it in my direction with the wild determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You've destroyed everything," she said, her voice cracking with hysteria and rage. 40 years of building, of planning, of creating something perfect and beautiful, and you've ruined it all with your jealousy and your lies and your pathetic need for attention. Perfect. I laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the tense air of our hallway. "You call theft and murder and systematic abuse perfect. You call destroying innocent people's lives beautiful. We gave you everything!" Beatrice screamed, the pistol wavering dangerously in her unsteady grip. "A beautiful home, a respected position in the community, marriage to the most successful man in the county. We tried to make you worthy of the honor, but you were too weak, too common, too stupid to appreciate what we were offering." The front door exploded inward as federal agents breached it with professional efficiency, their weapons drawn, and their voices commanding immediate surrender. Beatrice spun toward the sound, momentarily distracted, and I used that instant to dive behind the heavy oak console table that dominated our hallway. What followed was brief but intense a standoff between Beatrice and federal agents that ended with her surrender after they made it clear that resistance would only add to the overwhelming charges already being prepared against her. Arthur was arrested while still gasping for breath on our hallway floor, his hands cuffed behind his back, as agents read him his rights in voices that carried the professional satisfaction of law enforcement officers who had successfully closed a major case. Dr. Morrison was detained for questioning about his role in the conspiracy to have me falsely committed, though it became clear that he had been more naive than criminal in his participation in their schemes. As federal agents led my tormentors away in handcuffs, I experienced something I had never felt before: absolute certainty that justice was not just possible, but inevitable. The evidence I had gathered was so comprehensive, so methodically documented, that their convictions were virtually guaranteed. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Sarah Collins, the lead investigator on the case, approached me with professional respect that no one had shown me in nearly 2 years. "Mrs. Hartwell?" she said, her voice carrying genuine admiration. "I need to tell you that in 15 years of investigating financial crimes, I've never seen more thorough or methodical evidence gathering. The documentation you provided has already led us to 17 other victims and uncovered criminal activities that extend far beyond what we initially suspected." Thank you," I replied, my voice steady, despite the emotional magnitude of what had just occurred. I had excellent teachers in methodical planning. They just didn't realize they were training me to use their own techniques against them. Agent Collins smiled with the grim satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served after a complex investigation. "We'll need extensive testimony from you about their crimes and your treatment at their hands, but I can guarantee that you'll be protected throughout the legal process. Based on the evidence you've provided, neither Arthur nor Beatrice Hartwell will ever be in a position to threaten you or anyone else again." As federal agents completed their search of our house, confiscating boxes of evidence and documenting what had been both my prison and my preparation ground for war, I felt something I had thought was lost forever: hope for a future that belonged entirely to me. The girl who had walked down the church aisle believing in fairy tale endings was gone, but in her place stood a woman who understood that the best endings have to be written with courage, intelligence, and the kind of determination that can only be forged in the crucible of absolute desperation. I had survived the worst that Arthur and Beatrice could inflict, and I had turned their own weapons against them with precision that would have impressed them if they had been capable of understanding what I had accomplished. The war was over, and I had won it completely. The legal proceedings that followed Arthur and Beatrice's arrest, unfolded with the methodical precision of justice finally allowed to operate without obstruction. The evidence I had gathered proved even more valuable than federal investigators had initially realized, providing them with a complete blueprint of criminal activities that had been operating throughout our region for nearly a decade. Arthur's meticulous record-keeping, which had been intended to protect him from criminal partners who might attempt betrayal instead, provided prosecutors with detailed documentation of financial crimes that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of victims. The photographs I had taken of his ledgers revealed not just individual acts of embezzlement, but the structure of an entire criminal network that had been systematically looting the financial resources of rural communities throughout the Midwest. Your husband's obsession with documentation was his ultimate downfall, Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh explained during one of our preparation sessions for the trial. Criminals often believe that detailed records will protect them by demonstrating their sophistication, but in reality, they're creating the evidence for their own prosecution. The trial became a media sensation that dominated regional headlines for months. Arthur and Beatrice's carefully maintained reputation as pillars of respectability made their exposure as cold-blooded criminals even more shocking to the public, while the details of their systematic abuse of me transformed what might have been a routine financial case into a compelling story of survival and justice. Arthur's testimony proved to be a masterclass in self-destruction. His attempts to minimize his crimes and shift blame to criminal partners only served to highlight the scope of his illegal activities, while his efforts to portray me as mentally unstable were thoroughly demolished by the recordings I had made of our conversations and the medical evidence documenting his violence against me. The defendant would have this court believe that his wife's accusations are products of mental illness, Prosecutor Walsh observed during her closing argument, but the evidence demonstrates that Eleanor Hartwell showed remarkable courage, intelligence, and determination in exposing a criminal conspiracy that had been destroying lives for years. The only mental illness in this courtroom belongs to defendants who believed they could steal abuse and murder without consequences. Beatrice's trial was even more devastating, as her own recorded words provided irrefutable evidence of her role as the mastermind behind much of their criminal enterprise. Her attempt to present herself as Arthur's victim, manipulated by a domineering son into participating in crimes she didn't understand, collapsed completely when prosecutors played recordings of her planning sessions and her matter-of-fact discussions of previous murders. Mrs. Hartwell's own voice convicts her more thoroughly than any witness testimony could accomplish, the prosecutor noted with satisfaction. These recordings reveal a woman of exceptional intelligence and calculation, someone who planned and executed sophisticated crimes with professional precision. Her attempts to portray herself as a confused elderly woman are contradicted by her own documented words and actions. The sentences, when they finally came, reflected the full weight of federal justice applied to criminals who had shown no mercy to their victims. Arthur received life without parole for embezzlement conspiracy and 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Margaret and 2 other women. Beatrice received death by electric chair for her role as mastermind of the criminal network and her direct participation in multiple murders. But the legal consequences were only part of their punishment. The publicity surrounding the trial destroyed any remaining traces of the respectable reputation they had spent decades building, exposing them to their community as the monsters they had always been beneath their facade of respectability. Their criminal network collapsed completely as other participants rushed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. The money they had stolen was recovered and returned to victims while their assets were seized to pay restitution for damages they had caused. Most satisfying was the discovery that their elaborate escape plans had been built on foundations as false as everything else in their lives. The accounts in Buenos Aires contained far less money than they had claimed, and their contacts for new identities were themselves federal informants who had been feeding information to law enforcement for years. The divorce proceedings were handled quietly and efficiently, with Arthur's criminal conviction making it impossible for him to contest my requests for dissolution of our marriage and restoration of my maiden name. The house on Elm Street was sold to pay restitution to victims, its perfect facade finally stripped away to reveal the corruption that had festered within its walls. As I packed my few remaining possessions from the house where I had suffered so much, I felt no sadness or nostalgia for the life I was leaving behind. The woman who had been Eleanor Hartwell was gone, as completely as if she had never existed, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of protecting herself from those who would exploit her trust or kindness. 6 months after the trials ended, I boarded a train bound for Chicago carrying everything I owned in 2 small suitcases and my purse. I had chosen Chicago not because I had connections there, but because it offered the anonymity of size and the opportunities that came with a city large enough for someone to disappear into and reinvent herself completely. The city welcomed me with the indifferent kindness of a place too busy with its own concerns to ask uncomfortable questions about where people came from or why they needed fresh starts. I found a small apartment in a neighborhood where working women lived independent, quiet lives, and I discovered that the skills I had learned during my marriage, careful observation, methodical planning, the ability to read people's motivations and weaknesses, translated remarkably well into legitimate professional work. My first job was as a file clerk in a law office specializing in criminal defense, but my attention to detail and my intuitive understanding of criminal psychology quickly caught the attention of senior partners. Within a year, I had been promoted to paralegal, and within 3 years I was handling some of the firm's most complex cases involving white-collar crime and domestic violence. Eleanor has an unusual gift for pattern recognition. My supervisor, Margaret Chen, observed during my annual review. She approaches cases with methodical thoroughness that usually takes decades to develop, and she has insights into criminal behavior that help us build stronger cases for our clients. What Margaret didn't understand was that my thoroughness had been forged in circumstances where missing details could have cost me my life, and my insights into criminal behavior came from first-hand experience with sophisticated psychological manipulation. I threw myself into this work with passion, born from personal understanding of what victims endured and what justice could accomplish. Every case I helped resolve, every criminal I helped convict, felt like another small victory against the forces that had tried to destroy me. I was using hard-won knowledge to protect others from the kind of systematic abuse I had survived. Years passed in productive routine. I made friends among colleagues who knew me only as Eleanor Vance, competent, reliable, mysteriously reluctant to discuss her past, but generous with her time and expertise when others needed help. I developed interests and hobbies that had nothing to do with survival and gradually learned to trust my own judgment again in personal relationships. But I never completely lowered my guard. Some part of me remained alert for threats, watchful for signs that my past might resurface in ways that could endanger the life I had built. That vigilance proved justified when 8 years after Arthur and Beatrice's executions, I received a phone call that brought my carefully constructed present into collision with ghosts from my destroyed past. "Miss Vance?" The voice belonged to a young woman, probably in her 20s, with careful politeness that suggested she was making a difficult call. "My name is Susan Morrison, and I'm calling about my father, Dr. Morrison. I believe you knew him during his time in Indiana." Dr. Morrison had died the previous month, Susan explained, and while settling his estate, she had discovered documents he had apparently been saving for years. Among those papers was a sealed envelope addressed to Eleanor Vance, with instructions that it should be forwarded to me personally if anything happened to him. "I hired an investigator to locate you," Susan continued. "My father left specific instructions that this envelope should be delivered only to you and only after his death. He seemed to believe it contained information you would want to know. We arranged to meet at a restaurant in downtown Chicago, Neutral Territory, where I could assess this unexpected contact without compromising my security." Susan proved to be an earnest young teacher who clearly had no understanding of the significance of what she was delivering, and the envelope she handed me bore Dr. Morrison's distinctive handwriting and an official medical seal. Inside was a confession that revealed details about Arthur and Beatrice's previous crimes that had never emerged during their trials, along with documentation that provided the final missing pieces of their criminal history. "My dear Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have finally found courage to share information I should have revealed years ago. Information that I hope will provide closure regarding the full scope of what the Hartwells did to you and to others." Dr. Morrison's confession revealed that he had been complicit in covering up not just Margaret's murder, but the deaths of at least 5 other women over a period of 20 years. Arthur and Beatrice had been operating their criminal enterprise far longer than anyone had suspected, systematically targeting and eliminating women who threatened their security while building reputations that made their crimes unthinkable to their communities. I told myself I was protecting innocent people from scandal. He wrote that exposing these crimes would destroy families and institutions that had nothing to do with the Hartwells' activities. But the truth is that I was a coward who chose money and social standing over justice and human decency. The letter included newspaper clippings about Arthur and Beatrice's final fate details that had not been widely reported, but that provided satisfying confirmation of justice completed. Arthur had died in federal prison just 2 years into his sentence, killed by another inmate whose family farm had been lost to foreclosure after Arthur embezzled money from the agricultural cooperative. The killing had been swift and brutal, a homemade knife to the heart during a carefully planned attack that left no doubt about the motive behind it. But it was information about Beatrice's final months that provided the most poetic conclusion to their story. Beatrice had indeed been executed as scheduled, but according to prison records that Dr. Morrison had obtained through medical contacts, her final weeks had been marked by a complete psychological breakdown that left her trapped in delusions remarkably similar to the mental prison she had tried to create for me. She had become convinced that prison staff were systematically poisoning her food, that invisible enemies were plotting to drive her insane by confining her in small spaces and monitoring her every movement. She had refused meals, barricaded herself in her cell, and spent her final days in a state of paranoid terror that mirrored exactly the psychological torture she had inflicted on her victims. She died as she had lived, Dr. Morrison noted, as a prisoner of her own cruelty, experiencing firsthand the kind of systematic psychological abuse she had perfected as a weapon against others. As I finished reading Dr. Morrison's confession and the accompanying documentation, I felt a sense of completion that I had never expected to experience. Justice had been served not just through legal channels, but through the kind of ironic reversal that suggested the universe itself had taken interest in balancing moral equations. Arthur and Beatrice had tried to write my story as a tragedy, casting me as victim in their narrative of perfect domestic order maintained through violence and intimidation. Instead, I had written the ending myself, not just surviving their systematic cruelty, but turning their own methods against them with such precision that they had ultimately destroyed themselves through their attempts to destroy me. That evening, I walked through Chicago's busy streets, feeling lighter than I had in years. The ghosts of my past had been finally laid to rest, and the future stretched ahead with unlimited possibilities, for someone who had learned that survival required not just courage, but intelligence, patience, and absolute refusal to accept the role others tried to assign you. I was 31 years old, successful in work that gave my life meaning, surrounded by friends who valued me for who I had become, rather than pitying me for what I had endured. I had found peace not in forgetting my past, but in transforming it into strength that could protect others from similar predators. The fairy tale ending I had once dreamed of was gone forever, replaced by something far more valuable: certain knowledge that I was capable of surviving anything life might inflict, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, was always possible for those brave enough to fight for it. As I prepared for bed in the apartment that belonged entirely to me, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from victim to victor. The girl who had believed in happily ever after was gone, but the woman who had learned to write her own ending was here to stay, and that I realized with deep satisfaction was the most perfect ending of all.